on the carousel. All right.
One.
You're listening to the 50,000 watt clear channel voice of news radio.
3, 2.
In this program, we have a panel of communications experts who will be commenting on some taped interviews in a discussion with the participants. For the benefit of this program, the interviewers were asked to take on different attitudes. You'll also see me as part of the audience and as an interviewer. How does a journalist's attitude affect an interview? This is one of the questions that Dave Stevens from CBC Radio will be addressing during this program.
Thanks for coming out today. What we're trying to do in this panel is to look at interviewing and some of the dynamics related to the art of interviewing, and it really is an art. Now, what we're going to do is show you a number of interviews, or at least parts of interviews. Some will simulate a print interview, some will be like a television interview, and others will be like a radio interviewer. Now, the interviewers have deliberately taken on different attitudes. They've been told to be either aggressive or sympathetic or naive. The video clips you'll see each have something to say about the interview process. And each of the clips will focus on the interviewee and look at how he or she responded to the interview situation. Now, before we begin, I'd like to introduce our panel here today. First, Mayruth Sarsfield, who is the host of International Editors on PBS. Next to her is Edmund de Rogoff, who is a former communications professor at the University of Ottawa. Tina Spencer is the City Life editor at the Ottawa Citizen, and Ewart Walters is the editor of The Spectrum in Ottawa. Now, before we go to any of the clips, I'd like to ask the members of the panel, in general terms, what makes a good interview? What are the dynamics that lead to a good interview?
I think you have to know your audience, and when you're interviewing, you have to know how much that interviewer can bring out. And the interviewer usually knows a lot, but the interviewee is the person who has the information. And sometimes it's like drawing hen's teeth, and other times it flows like a gush, and you have to monitor it.
It's got to be a conversation. It really is. It's a method of telling a story. And that's something that we sometimes forget. Well, a number of you mentioned the word preparation there, and I think that's important for the first clip we're going to see. The first interview was conducted by Tony LaFaro, who is a reporter with the Ottawa Citizen. He's interviewing Fiona Lam, who's with the Chinese-Canadian National Council, the Ottawa chapter. Fiona knew what she wanted to say. She was prepared. She gave pointed examples in her interview. Her speech was excellent, and she didn't have an attitude. But in this interview, Tony was asked not to know anything about the issue being discussed. Let's go to that clip.
Can you explain the head tax on Chinese Canadians that was implemented by the federal government many, many years ago?
Back in 1885, after the CPR was completed, the railroad was completed, the federal government wanted to halt and restrict Chinese immigration. Specifically, not other kinds of immigration, but Chinese immigration particularly. So it started out with an 1885 piece of legislation that imposed a head tax of $50, which was about a year's wages back then, on any incoming Chinese immigrants. That didn't stop the flow, however, and so they increased it to $100 in 1900, and then $500, which was about 2 years' wages, in 1903.
What were the reasons for the head tax?
Well, there was a whole racial hierarchy, a philosophy of a racial hierarchy going on at that time, where certain immigrants were seen as desirable. British immigrants, Eastern European immigrants for a while as farmers, but the Asian immigrants were seen as undesirable and unassimilable and so forth, and so they wanted to keep those people out.
Do the Asian Canadians want an apology or monetary compensation for the head tax?
I think it's both. The monetary redress wouldn't be very much. The official request is for $10,000, which is how much the $500 head tax would be with interest from the turn of the century. Actually, it's a bit less than than what it would have been with interest. But the apology would be a significant step, and some kind of historical, symbolic monument of some kind of plaque, a recognition of it, because nowadays certainly most Canadians aren't taught about this history.
Was that a good interview, Tina?
It was very clear. Responses to the questions were quite simple. She wasn't giving him too much information. He appeared to be understanding her. Yes, I think she went in knowing what she wanted to get across as a point, knowing what she wanted to leave a viewer with, and I think it was effective.
Yes. What medium would this type of interview, or would that interview be best suited for? May Ruth?
I'd love to have seen it on television, because I think she had such a glow and such an interest, and she was really such an engaging person. I thought, as a complete little interview, and I think he did 2 or 3 questions?
3 questions.
3
yeah.
questions, and that was about the amount of information I'd like to have had, and those were the kind of questions that would make me think about it.
Tina, did you have something to add there?
Well, I think one of the first obligations of a journalist doing an interview is to try to set the interviewee at some kind of ease, assuming what they want out of that interview is actual information. I mean, sometimes journalists interview people and they don't really even want information. They want to make a point or do a performance or something. And I think it's fair to say to someone being interviewed, you might want to think a little bit about what that journalist is actually after in this interview. The way that's set up, he obviously wants the information. He wants to know what this issue is about. And he asks his questions in a very unthreatening way in order to relax the person he's talking to. From the point of view of the interviewee, she's already very relaxed, probably because she's prepared, because she knows what she wants to say. So the chemistry that you see in that clip seems very good, very positive. You get the impression these 2 people could just sit down for a cup of coffee and keep going for a while.
Yeah. It was unthreatening, but he didn't seem to convey that he didn't know a lot about the subject either, which I think was important, because if she'd felt that she'd have to start at about the grade 3 level with him.
But we tell print people to ask very open-ended questions, and if the role you're going to be, if you don't know anything about the subject, you don't want to sit there and bluff either. That's not fair to the person you're interviewing. Ask an open-ended question, ask a dumb question. When you're in print, of course, you can do that, because nobody's going to see how dumb you look.
Or you can edit it out.
That's right. When you actually sit down to write your story, of course, you can edit out how dumb you were. That's something that TV and broadcast folks don't get the luxury of doing.
The next set of interviews simulate interviews done in a radio studio. In this first one, Anna Chiappa, the former executive director of the Canadian Ethno-Cultural Council, is being interviewed by Deborah Carter, a master's journalism student at Carleton University. Now, in this interview, Deborah was well prepared. She knew her subject matter, and she came to the interview with a point of view. Let's go to that clip.
Thank you. Ms. Chiappa, you seem to think that the Canadian government isn't doing enough to encourage multiculturalism, but if you look around you, you see all kinds of different people living in harmony together. We have Chinatown, we have Little Italy. What's wrong with the kind of multiculturalism that we have in Canada right now?
Well, I think you're introducing a number of questions there. One is you saying that I feel that the government isn't doing enough about multiculturalism. I think that the government is regressing on their commitments to multiculturalism and to a national policy on multiculturalism and the subsequent programs around it. With respect to different communities, whether they're Chinatown or the Italian section or whatever, those are communities that have been there in Canada and will always exist, whether we have a multiculturalism policy or not.
Isn't there a danger, though, that by emphasizing multiculturalism, we're actually dividing Canadian society rather than promoting the fact that everybody's equal? So why emphasize difference when we're all equal in the final analysis?
I'm not sure where you have this idea that multiculturalism is divisive. People are different. Canadians are different. Each one of us is different. We come from different parts of the country, whether we're Easterners or Westerners or Northerners or Torontonians. Each one has a unique characteristic which makes us who we are and Canadians. And that doesn't mean we're divided or divisive. Some of us have different heritage, different backgrounds.
But why should the government then fund multicultural groups? If we're all equal, we're all the same and everything else, why should the government have to bankroll and support multicultural organizations?
Well, I think you may have had the wrong information. I don't think the government is particularly funding multicultural groups.
This might be a good time to remind everyone that the journalists are not behaving as themselves, but they were told to take a certain approach here. But we're focusing on the interviewee. And panel, how do you think that Ana Chiappa handled herself in that particular instance?
Very humanly, which is good and bad in both ways. For all three of those reasonably hostile questions, we have an interviewer who starts by stating a premise and then going from there. We have an interviewee who tries to rebut that premise or tries to deal with it, but gets understandably very personally involved in the chemistry, I think. Rather than, the way you can deal with that when you have a hostile interviewer is to literally deal with the question, kind of ignore the personality that threw it at you, and just deal with that. And I think there's heat directed at her, and she responds to that a little bit. She's pretty cool overall. I mean, she does still respond and stay on focus, which is great, and very tough to do. But you also sense that she's kind of, you know, who are you to ask me that? And you just, it kind of muddies up the point that she's making, which is basically well stated, but you don't get past that easily when you're listening to it, in our case, watching it. What did you guys think?
Yeah, well, I thoroughly agree, and each of the questions, for instance, was answered saying, I don't know where you got that information, implied, what the heck do you know about this whole thing, or you got it all wrong, or whatever, but you're personalizing in a hostile manner, while from the point of view of the interviewee, while the interviewer was being hostile or aggressive, but just to the issue, not to the person.
Anna, how did you feel about that interview?
There's a tendency when you're dealing with an issue like the issue that we're dealing with, that there's an immediate hostility, and it's really nothing to do with the two people in the room. It's the hostility that's out there that is being put into the room. And you have two individuals who are coming from very different points of view. One whose job, I think, is I want to get the story out and create some controversy. It doesn't matter what this person's going to say, because I'm going to create the controversy. And I've been in situations like that, and I don't know how you can actually respond to it other than turning it around and creating more controversy. And I'm not sure whether that's really healthy, you know.
When people ask questions that are hostile in content to the ideas that we hold, you have to really respond to it by responding to the idea, the premise of the idea. Because there are a lot of people out there, sometimes a majority depending on where you're directing your focus, who actually believe those things. And some of them are not bozos. Some of them are smart people, like who've thought through that position and they've still reached that position.
Okay, we'll move on to our next set of interviews now, which are meant to simulate a television interview that would be shot in the field. And these interviews would be used for a feature story or maybe a news story, so they wouldn't run as interviews in their entirety. The first is with Farhat Kurd, who is the president of the Ottawa chapter of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, and she is being interviewed by Becky Reiner, who is a freelance broadcast journalist. And the strongest part of this interview is when Farhat personalizes her responses. Let's watch this one.
Now, Farhat, you had mentioned that Muslim women themselves make the choice whether to cover themselves or not. And I notice you don't wear the veil. I know that's not the proper term, but I notice you don't wear the veil. Why is that?
Well, I know I get that question a lot of the times. Basically, I just, when I was growing up, I didn't cover and it wasn't emphasized. But the culture around you, I reflected that, and you know how when I was growing up, modernity was equated with being westernized, and being progressive was being westernized. And
were you reluctant to dress as a Muslim woman?
Yes.
Because it would draw attention to you?
Yes, and I didn't want that persistent questioning. And as it is, even now when I'm in my workplace, and I have worked in various departments where I work, and every time you go to a new setting, you're questioned, and it's not unpleasant, but you want to the personal questions that you keep being asked.
Like what? What kind of questions are people asking you?
Well, because that's another issue with Muslim women. You know, they when they are in a public space, they have to be aware of who they are. And Muslim women, because faith plays such a big part in our lives, there are certain things we cannot do, like say dietary requirements, and you know, I will say I don't eat pork, so there's the questioning too. And also people are constantly asking you where you're from. It doesn't matter that I've been in Canada for 27 years, but you know, where are you from? And then I have to think back, oh, I'm from Hamilton. Oh, you mean where I'm from originally? Yes, I'm from Kashmir.
Panelists, what do you think of the personal approach, both in the questions and the answers?
I liked it. I wish it had gone on longer.
Now, why is that?
Because I was very interested in the things she was saying.
It's almost as if we were being told a story, and it ended halfway
She
through.
brought it in, and she started a bit slowly. The interviewer handled it very well, because she did interrupt, but in a very, very warm, flowing way. And I just felt I wanted to know more. But she also gave information. She didn't just give the personal experience. She said, this is what Muslim women do. This is what they are asked. This is what they expect. This is the kind of privateness of their lives. And I really wanted to know more.
All right, how did that interview compare to other interviews you may have done in the past, both with more aggressive type interviews and also those who are only interested in hearing from you as the head of your organization, as opposed to a human being who may have a story to tell?
Every interview that I've done in the past has sort of had a personal bearing on it, just because of the fact that there is so much diversity that one person is asking to represent. So when I answer, I have not only to, you know, sort of give that impression that I'm coming from a diverse background, which in this community there will be various viewpoints, and I can't speak to all of them.
Same time, a good rule of thumb is go with what you know, and what do you know better than your own life story too. So if you are uncomfortable, as many people are in front of TV cameras, yours truly included, that might not be a bad approach. So, okay. We have one more interview. In this last interview, you'll see a situation in which both parties are fairly well matched, both knew their subject matter, both are articulate, and both were in control. Gerard H.N., president of the National Capital Alliance on Race Relations, is being interviewed by Becky Reiner.
But again, if we are talking about groups of Asians, Hispanics, blacks, what is wrong with the way the media portrays them?
Too many stereotypes. Too often it's negative.
Like what? Do you have examples?
Absolutely. You look at the early 70s, all those things have changed, but whenever a crime was committed by somebody who happens to be black, they would first mention the fact that the ethnic or the racial origin of the person is black, sometimes out of context. If they were doing it for the purposes of describing the individual who committed a crime, there's no problem. If they are doing it to somehow portray or further the idea that blacks are criminal, then there's a problem.
Don't you think if a white man had raped a woman that would have been announced by the media?
And I think that's essentially the point. The media will not say a white man has raped a woman. They will say a woman was raped by a man. They do not say a white man. However, if it was a black man, they will tell you a black youth, a black teenager, a black male has raped a woman, which brings the idea of negative stereotype. Because in the context when they say it, sometimes it's not relevant at all. It is just to build on sometimes the fears of people when they put or they stigmatize an entire group by the act of one individual. And
You're a Haitian man. Have you been victimized by these negative stereotypes?
Oh, absolutely.
How?
Absolutely. When I was going to University of Ottawa in the early 80s, one of the most difficult things I had to encounter, and if you remember the context at the time, it was the emergence of AIDS. And they were looking at target groups of people who had AIDS, and the media, the individuals who have the responsibility to communicate the news, were saying that like homosexuals, Haitians, were part of those target groups. Now, to stigmatize a whole nation like that was very painful.
What did you think about what Gerard had to say?
He's very specific in his answers. He's got good examples, and he's quite succinct in delivering them. I think he does a really good job in that.
Crisp.
Yeah,
very nicely done. Of course, I take issue with the perception implied in the question. Did you have a racially motivated experience? And the implicit in the question is that if you didn't, then somehow the whole business of racism is minimized. But never mind, in this case he did have one and he handled it well.
Well, maybe, I don't want to be defending Becky, but we were talking earlier about personalizing it, and if there had been a pre-interview done, had she just said, tell me about your experience, it might have further proven your point here, where the person watching might have assumed.
Even if the questions are personalized and you did not have a personal experience, you could say, I did not personally, but my neighbor, my friend, my cousin or my sister did have one, and these were the circumstances, which will still keep personalizing the whole example without losing any power in the answer itself. So I think it was really very good that Becky was asking personal questions. Even if Gerard did not have his own experience, certainly as a member of an organization who is defending and fighting for certain issues, those experiences come to his knowledge on a daily basis, and therefore that's why he's representing an organization, not just himself.
So it's there are a lot of questions that you wish people were intelligent enough not to have to ask. And then they bring their stupidity to you and want you to be serious and sensible, and they want you to enlighten a whole bunch of cretins who really are, I hate to say it, but not worth enlightening, because they're not going to change. That's not a nice thing to say, and I really am going to be ashamed of what I said in 2 minutes.
Well, I don't think it is that easy, because the views are not only held by cretins. As a matter of fact, one of the panelists mentioned it earlier, those views are held by very highly intelligent people. And the first question I was asked was the media portraying minorities in a negative way? And my answer was, well, no, you cannot talk about the media, because the media is a collection of individuals. So ask me if the individuals controlling the media are portraying minorities in a different way. And the whole issue is that, yes, they are one, and then these are highly intelligent, educated people.
Empowered.
So empowered people. So therefore, you have almost an obligation as a minority organizations to teach those people. They may be cretins in their attitudes, but in terms of society's perception of them, they're the power brokers. They're the one who are going to decide whether or not you as a minority have an opportunity.
Regarding the whole point of interviewing, accepting an interview or changing the media, or whether they are as bright as we hope them to be or not, and the whole question that perhaps we have to understand when we are doing an interview is that it's just one point in a long process when we are trying to forward any issue of any kind. One interview is just trying to win a war with one bullet in your gun. It cannot be done. You just need all the machine guns with all the bullets, and then you might get something across.
So it's never in vain.
It's never in vain, and it's never ending.
Well, while this issue is never ending, this program is, and unfortunately we're out of time. I want to thank everyone for coming out today, and I'd like to thank our panelists, Mayruth Sarsfield, Edmund DeRogoff, Tina Spencer, and Ewart Walters. It's been a most interesting discussion. Thanks to all of you.